May 20, 1969. After 10 days of brutal fighting, American soldiers finally reached the summit of a mountain in South Vietnam. They had climbed through mud, rain, jungle, machine gun fire, grenades, rockets, and a maze of North Vietnamese bunkers. Some units had been nearly torn apart. Hundreds of Americans had been killed or wounded. Aircraft had dropped more than 1 million pounds of bombs. Artillery had pounded the mountain again and again. And when the fighting was finally over, the Americans controlled Hill 937. The soldiers called it Hamburger Hill, but then something happened that shocked many Americans back home. Just over 2 weeks later, U.S. forces left the mountain. There was no permanent base. No major American force remained behind to defend it. The hill that soldiers had fought so desperately to capture was simply abandoned. And eventually, North Vietnamese troops returned. So why did America sacrifice so much to capture a mountain it never intended to hold? Was Hamburger Hill a meaningless battle, or was the real objective something completely different? To understand the answer, we have to go back to one of the most dangerous places in South Vietnam, the Shau Valley. By 1969, the Vietnam War had already changed dramatically. The Tet Offensive of 1968 had shaken American confidence in the war. Militarily, communist forces had suffered devastating losses. Politically, however, Tet had created a much more serious problem for Washington. Millions of Americans were beginning to question whether victory was actually possible. Lyndon Johnson had decided not to seek another term as president. Richard Nixon entered the White House promising to find a way out of the war. Peace negotiations were taking place in Paris, and the United States was beginning to think seriously about transferring more responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. But American troops were still fighting, and one of the most important enemy logistical areas remained the Shau Valley. The valley ran through western South Vietnam near the border with Laos. For North Vietnam, it was extremely valuable. Men, ammunition, food, communications equipment, and other supplies could move through the region from the Ho Chi Minh Trail network in Laos toward battlefields inside South Vietnam. The surrounding mountains provided concealment. Dense jungle protected movement from observation, and the nearby border offered another advantage. If North Vietnamese units came under overwhelming pressure, they could move toward sanctuary areas in Laos. American commanders had tried repeatedly to disrupt enemy operations in the Shau Valley. In May 1969, they would try again. The operation was called Apache Snow. 5 infantry battalions from American and South Vietnamese forces were inserted into the valley. The concept seemed straightforward. The units would search different sectors. If one battalion found a major North Vietnamese force, other units could be moved to reinforce it. American mobility and firepower would help trap and destroy the enemy before he could escape. But Apache Snow was not originally a mission to capture one famous hill. Hill 937 became important only after American troops discovered what was waiting there. The mountain was known locally as Dong Ap Bia. It rose roughly 937 meters above sea level. That number gave it its American military designation, Hill 937. The mountain was covered by thick jungle. Some areas contained double or even triple canopy vegetation. Bamboo and elephant grass restricted movement. The slopes were steep. Visibility could shrink to only a few yards. And beneath that vegetation, North Vietnamese soldiers had constructed defensive positions. Bunkers, trenches, fighting positions, covered routes. The terrain did not simply protect the defenders. It weakened many of America's greatest advantages. Helicopters could not simply land wherever commanders wanted. Aircraft could struggle to identify targets. Artillery and air support became dangerous when American and North Vietnamese soldiers were fighting only a few yards apart. And infantry formations that normally depended on speed and mutual support were forced into narrow approaches through the jungle. The mountain was becoming a battlefield designed for close combat. On May 10th, Operation Apache Snow began. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, was among the American forces inserted into the area. They were known as the Rakkasans. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt. Initially, contact with the enemy was limited, but captured documents suggested something important. The North Vietnamese 29th Regiment was operating somewhere in the Shau Valley. American commanders expected a fight. What they did not yet understand was how determined the North Vietnamese were to defend Dong Ap Bia. On May 11th, American troops began encountering much stronger resistance. Bravo Company moved toward the mountain. North Vietnamese troops opened fire. Honeycutt called for helicopter gunships. Then the jungle created one of the dangers that would haunt the battle. The gunships misidentified an American position. They attacked friendly troops. 2 Americans were killed and dozens were wounded. Honeycutt himself was among the wounded. It was an early warning. Even America's enormous firepower could become difficult to control in terrain like this. American soldiers continued moving toward the mountain, and with every attack, the scale of the defenses became clearer. This was not a handful of enemy scouts. The Americans were facing a prepared North Vietnamese force. The defenders had used the mountain itself as a weapon. Bunkers were difficult to see until soldiers were already close. Machine guns could fire from concealed positions. North Vietnamese troops could move through covered routes. American soldiers climbing uphill became exhausted before they even reached the main defensive lines. Then came another problem. The enemy could reinforce during the night. American commanders believed that North Vietnamese troops and supplies were moving from the direction of Laos. Every day the battle continued gave the defenders more time to improve their positions. Honeycutt responded with repeated attacks, but the mountain kept throwing his men back. On May 14th and May 15th, coordinated American assaults failed. Soldiers sometimes advanced to within a few hundred yards of the summit. Then they were hit by intense fire. Rain turned the slopes into mud. Men climbing uphill slipped under the weight of weapons and equipment. Wounded soldiers had to be carried back down terrain that healthy soldiers could barely cross. American artillery and aircraft blasted the mountain before new attacks. Trees disappeared. Vegetation was shredded. The earth itself was torn apart. But many North Vietnamese bunkers survived. The defenders emerged after the bombardments and opened fire again. For soldiers on the ground, it began to feel as though the mountain was consuming men. That is where the name Hamburger Hill came from. The soldiers said the battle was grinding men into hamburger. By now, another American battalion was trying to approach the mountain. The 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, had been ordered to support the Rakkasan. On a map, the distance did not appear enormous. In reality, the jungle transformed a movement expected to take roughly a day into an exhausting multi-day struggle. Steep terrain slowed the troops. Enemy snipers harassed them. Landing zones had to be protected. Supply points needed security. The North Vietnamese could appear on the flanks or even behind American positions. The American concept depended on mobility. Dong Ap Bia took that mobility away, and the closer American soldiers came to the summit, the more violent the fighting became. On May 18th, a major coordinated attack went forward. The 3rd Battalion, 187th, attacked from one direction. The 1st Battalion, 506th, pressured the mountain from another. Delta Company of the 3rd Battalion, 187th, pushed dangerously close to the summit. They were within roughly 75 meters, but the cost was terrible. Every officer in the company was either killed or wounded. The company suffered more than 50% casualties. The fighting became extremely close. American and North Vietnamese soldiers exchanged rifle fire and grenades from distances measured in yards. Then nature intervened. A violent thunderstorm swept across the mountain. Visibility collapsed. The battlefield turned into mud. The Americans were forced to pull back again. For General Melvin Zayas, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, this created a serious decision. The battle was becoming famous. Reporters had arrived. The American public was beginning to hear about Hamburger Hill. Casualties were rising, and critics were already asking why American soldiers were being repeatedly sent against the same mountain. Zayas considered stopping the attack, but he decided to continue. His superiors supported him, and from the military perspective there was an important argument for doing so. The objective was not simply dirt. The enemy was there. American commanders believed significant elements of the North Vietnamese 29th Regiment were defending the mountain. The logic of American search and destroy operations was that when a major enemy force was located, it should be fixed in place and destroyed. If the Americans withdrew simply because the enemy had chosen strong terrain, they would leave that enemy force intact. To commanders like Zayas and Honeycutt, that was unacceptable. This distinction is essential to understanding Hamburger Hill. The U.S. Army was not fighting because it desperately needed to build a permanent base on the summit. It was fighting because North Vietnamese troops had chosen to make their stand there. The mountain became the location of the battle. The enemy force was the objective, but that logic was becoming harder to explain to the American public, especially as the casualty list grew. On the morning of May 20th, the final assault began. This time, overwhelming combat power was assembled. 4 battalions attacked simultaneously. Before the infantry moved, American aircraft struck the mountain for approximately 2 hours. Artillery followed with a massive preparation. Then the infantry advanced. The defenders were now under pressure from several directions. North Vietnamese soldiers continued fighting from their bunkers. Some withdrew. Others remained and fought until American troops reached their positions. The Rakkasans pushed upward again. The same battalion that had absorbed devastating casualties during the previous days wanted to be part of the final attack. They reached the summit. By late afternoon, Hill 937 was secure. After 10 days, Hamburger Hill belonged to the Americans. The cost was enormous. According to a U.S. Army Combat Studies Institute account, 70 American soldiers were killed and 372 wounded during the battle. Roughly 1,800 American troops were eventually committed. 10 artillery batteries supported the battle. The U.S. Air Force flew 272 attack sorties. More than 1 million pounds of bombs were dropped. More than 150,000 pounds of napalm were used. American troops found more than 600 North Vietnamese dead around the battlefield. Whatever else could be said about Hamburger Hill, the North Vietnamese force defending it had suffered devastating losses. From a traditional battlefield perspective, the Americans had won. They had attacked a fortified enemy position. They had broken through its defenses. They had forced surviving defenders away. And they controlled the battlefield when the fighting ended. But the political battle was only beginning. Photographs and reports from Hamburger Hill reached the United States at one of the most sensitive moments of the war. Americans were hearing their government talk about peace. They were hearing about Vietnamization. They were hearing that the United States wanted South Vietnam to assume more responsibility for its own defense. And at the same time, American soldiers appeared to be dying in repeated assaults on a remote mountain. Senator Edward Kennedy became one of the most prominent critics. Other members of Congress questioned the tactics and the strategy. To critics, Hamburger Hill represented everything that seemed wrong with the war. A mountain was attacked again and again. Young Americans died. The summit was captured. And then came the event that transformed a controversial battle into a symbol. On June 5, 1969, U.S. forces left Hill 937. Just over 2 weeks after capturing it, the mountain had not suddenly lost a permanent strategic value. The Americans had never planned to turn the summit into territory that had to be occupied indefinitely. Operation Apache Snow was ending. American forces moved elsewhere. But to millions of people watching from home, the distinction barely mattered. They saw a simple sequence. Americans fought for the hill. Americans died taking the hill. Then America abandoned the hill. It looked meaningless. And that is why Hamburger Hill became far more important politically than it was geographically. The controversy exposed a fundamental problem with the American strategy in Vietnam. How do you measure victory in a war where capturing territory is often temporary? In World War II, Americans understood the movement of armies across maps. Normandy was captured. Paris was liberated. Germany was invaded. Territory changed hands as the front moved forward. Vietnam was different. American units might enter an area, locate enemy forces, fight them, then move somewhere else. The purpose was often to destroy enemy units rather than permanently occupy every piece of ground. Militarily, that could make sense. Politically, it could be extremely difficult to explain. Hamburger Hill demonstrated that gap with brutal clarity. Supporters of the operation argued that American troops had located a major North Vietnamese force and inflicted severe losses on it. From that perspective, leaving the mountain did not erase the battlefield victory. The mission had never been to own the hill forever. Critics saw something very different. If the hill was not important enough to hold, they asked, why were so many men ordered to attack it? Both interpretations reveal something important about the war. Hamburger Hill was not simply a story of commanders wasting lives for a useless piece of ground, but neither was it simply another conventional American victory. It was a battle produced by a strategy that increasingly conflicted with America's political reality. By 1969, Washington wanted to reduce American involvement. The public wanted fewer casualties. The Nixon administration was preparing to withdraw American troops. Yet American forces in Vietnam were still operating under conditions that could produce battles like Hamburger Hill. Those two realities could not continue forever. Less than 3 weeks after Hill 937 was abandoned, President Nixon announced the first major withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. The war would continue for years. American aircraft would keep bombing. American soldiers would keep fighting. But large ground battles involving American troops would become less politically acceptable. Hamburger Hill therefore occupies a strange place in military history. It was a tactical victory that looked like a strategic failure. It demonstrated extraordinary courage by American soldiers. It showed the skill and determination of North Vietnamese defenders. It revealed how terrain could neutralize enormous technological advantages. And it showed how winning a battlefield could still mean losing the argument over the war itself. The men who climbed Hill 937 did what they were ordered to do. They fought through conditions that are difficult to imagine today. Some repeatedly attacked positions that had already wounded or killed their friends. They continued upward through mud and machine gun fire. And eventually they took the summit. The question was never whether those soldiers fought bravely. They did. The harder question was whether the strategy asking them to make that sacrifice still made sense. That question followed America long after the troops walked away from Hamburger Hill. And more than half a century later, it remains the reason the battle is remembered. Not because Hill 937 was the most important mountain in Vietnam, but because it forced America to confront one of the most uncomfortable questions of the entire war. What does victory mean if you win the battle, leave the battlefield, and still cannot see how the war ends?